It must have been roughly February 2015 when Karsten and I first talked about the idea of a new Deponia. We also did get a lot of feedback in the past from the community who very much wanted to see another Rufus story. And then we basically just sat down and said, yeah, let's do some more. And of course, we had to achieve certain things with the game because we already released 3 games. So we definitely wanted to up our game here. I think Pokey wasn't really into the idea to create a new Deponia at first. Well, sure. After a trilogy, you ask yourself, should I do a 4th part? And the definite answer to that is no. That's a particularly bad idea. It's the worst idea you can have. Actually, he didn't have a choice, but I think he warmed up to the idea pretty quick. And the definite answer to that is no. So, we had basically no pre-production whatsoever for the new Deponia game. This was a tough situation, since the whole project map is not like you'd usually do it, or should do it, like you learn it in Project Management 101. That also had a bright side, because we started producing assets very early.
With Deponia Doomsday, for example, we got sketches from Pokey with pretty clear-cut ideas what would be in the screens, since he knows what happens, who acts, and what puzzles have to be solved. So he knows what elements are needed, and based on that, we make our own sketches accordingly.
Usually, we have to apply some changes to the screens when gameplay-related things don't work. That's why there are sometimes slight deviations. Otherwise, we stay pretty close to the Pokey scribbles.
Yeah, that's really... Pokey knows pretty well how he wants things done.
Yeah, that's almost correct. Pokey frantically tried to find a way to credibly continue this whole finished trilogy clutter. It's just totally finished. Everything that had to be told has been told. There was nothing left. You know how it is when things seem impossible? There is a certain attraction, a certain excitement to it. And somehow, in the middle of the night, I had a rough idea how I could make a 4th Deponia part. I had to giggle. And usually, when I start giggling, there's probably no turning back. And that set the foundation for Deponia 4. Deponia Doomsday. There was relatively little time for Pokey to come up with a story that made sense to him. The oldest trick in the book. I always wondered which book. There has to be a book somewhere where all the tricks are written down, and the oldest trick of all is, of course, when you don't continue a story, you pull a Deus Ex time travel. Yeah, anyway, nonetheless, I really enjoy these kinds of stories. And especially in Rufus's case, it's pretty forgiving, since you can stretch the laws of logic here and there. But I'm very happy that when you play the game a few times, you'll notice how very thoroughly everything's thought through. Both of us spent the first phase together at my place. So we'd have some semblance of peace and quiet, and then we started plastering the walls with timelines. Since they're all recurring, diverging, or intertwined at some point, etc., this became an incredibly confusing mess real quickly. A mess which spread across the whole wall. It stayed there for months, by the way. It looked a bit like the room of a mentally very ill person, but it only looked like it. It's far from any... Yeah. Where were we? Yeah, it became quite a lot bigger than we planned, than we anticipated. That's one of the qualities Pokey sometimes shows, this kind of mild overreaching. It's the fine line between genius and madness, you could say. And then we were in a situation where we'd have a much bigger project than we planned, and we just had to deal with that. But fuck it, we'll just do it. Well, actually, this project was not only story-wise, but also in terms of time management, impossible right from the beginning. Just like I love it. Strictly speaking, this wasn't doable. We always had quite a narrow time frame for production when it came to Deponia titles. We started Chaos on Deponia in February 2012 and released it in September 2012. For Goodbye Deponia, the third part, we had 1 year of production, pretty close to what we had this time. And Goodbye Deponia was about this big, while Deponia Doomsday upped that and got more like this. As a consequence, we actually had to start production when we were basically still in the concept phase. The hugest Deponia ever, dude!
The style is very consistent, that's worth mentioning. The style of the first parts was heavily influenced by one background artist, that was Michael Benrad, and it's our job to basically mimic this style.
It's, of course, difficult to gauge what exactly Pokey had in mind when it comes to backgrounds that haven't been there before, since Deponia Doomsday features a lot of new locations which haven't been in the other installments, like deserts and snowy landscapes, for example. That leaves a lot of leeway for your own creativity and for some ideas you might have and want to sprinkle in there. There was this tree in the time bubble, completely made from scrap, something that has never been in the game before. It looks like it's about 1 kilometer high, and that's something new as well. The time bubble is a particularly unique place, as Deponia usually has really down-to-earth locations, and this is a little almost otherworldly. And originally, we had something completely different in mind. Originally, the paths were made of piano keys, and the buildings were just floating around. The background was supposed to be littered with fractals, like, you know? But I'm very happy with how it turned out. All in all, with Pokey's ideas, it's a bit more down-to-earth and not as far out there. I think Deponia is something particularly appealing because there are actually no standard situations. I mean, the music can change completely from one screen to the next. It's sometimes a different genre, or a completely different instrumentation, or a different mood. We don't really have fixed conventions we have to cater to. We can throw around references. We can basically do what we want. That's a huge playground for a composer. Apart from that, we also get to use instruments that you just don't have in a standard orchestra. That's important too, to play with elements like that. Like in the time travel song, for instance, we have a theremin as an essential part of the song, which is a reference to the Doctor Who theme. And we have those horns in the beginning. Okay, that's a classic concert instrument, but also a reference to Back to the Future. Another goal of mine for Deponia 3 was that we, no matter which theme, always had to keep the Rufus theme in there. Basically, a small challenge I gave myself. And for Deponia 4, I didn't have this challenge. I didn't want to have such a dogmatic approach to it. But he is still our hero, and we see everything through his eyes. And accordingly, his theme is somehow omnipresent.
I was mostly responsible for the Deponia cutscenes. First, I got Pokey's storyboard, pretty little drawings, and those I translated into the proper Deponia style. Then I made all those sketches, which have been nicely rigged by Nick, and when that was set and done, I let Nick continue so he could flesh out and animate everything. When we were through with that, I helped animating and did all kinds of odds and ends, applied fixes, and made sure that everything stylistically came together nicely.
Well, back then I only did in-game animations, like hand-drawn with Photoshop. Since Deponia 3, I've been working on cutscenes, as I mentioned, still with After Effects. First, there are Pokey's little scribbles, and based on those, Simona creates layouts of the characters. And one of our backgrounders draws backgrounds for the cutscenes.
Everyone has a different approach with the backgrounds. Basically, everyone has their own technique. You can't generalize. But as a matter of fact, from Pokey's layout to the line art, it's all quite similar, since, theoretically, you have to be able to animate with only the line art, if you have to animate any background or character animations happening there. In my case, as an intermediate step, I did a variant complete in grayscale, where I just defined light and shadow, since I had to do a lot of night screens. There you basically had one light source, which illuminated certain things, just so I knew beforehand, okay, there's a lighter area and there's a darker area, and then I just created a color mood, all fleshed out and with colors, very roughly slapped on in a style you think is nice. And if that got approved, you could start with proper coloring, and I think each of us has their own technique to achieve the fastest results, yet still creating a consistent style in the end.
And then I get the backgrounds and layouts and start drawing in the characters cleanly. And the, greatest novelty when it comes to that in Deponia Doomsday is that we use Spine as our animation tool.
First, you have to know how this all works, how things seem to move. And it works by drawing many, many pictures of one character, each slightly different, and thus your eye perceives the sequence as a moving picture. With Spine, animations work a little different. Eventually, it comes down to drawing a character. Cutting them to pieces. And use them kind of like, well, like a puppet. You have all the single limbs and you can move them, and this is what makes the motion in the end. The special thing about Spine, however, is that you can not only move pieces, but also skew them, and this adds a nice three-dimensional touch.
There's this nice wedding scene where Goal turns around in her wedding dress with a very generous neckline, and that's when Simona instructed me on how I could, using Spine, place just the right bone to make Goal's breast jiggle perfectly. When she turns around. After I worked on that scene for a while, Simona suddenly came running into the room yelling, "Show me the boobies!" True story.
Well, there really were situations when we thought, this will never work out. How can we possibly do this? Pokey, yeah, he's a megalomaniac. He made us suffer through mass scenes full of yellow critters. This was our Battle of Helm's Deep. Those were mass scenes we never could have done without Spine as animation tool.
They're called Fulaks now, for copyright reasons. We're 1 year too early, because then the copyright on the name Morlock will expire. Some of you might know them from H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, and then we could have used it. But they're the Fulaks. There are a few more locks.
They're in a lot of scenes, and there's a lot going on. And the more characters you have on one screen, the more complicated things get. And I don't think we would have made it without the tool.
And that was the question in the beginning. How often do those appear in the cutscenes? Like, if you go through all that effort and set the picture to the music, and then there's one more video and one after that, and after that, keep in mind that you have to avoid monotony and make it cool every single time, and remember that you can play around with it. I generated an instrument to create a Morlock sound really fast. Starts right here. Here are some of the guys, just a few of them scattered. Has to sound a bit nasty. And when there's a lot of Morlocks, I can just... And voila!
My favorite cutscene is probably the one where Goal pulls Rufus out of a grave. It sounds weird, and it probably is. But there were nice perspectives, nice setups, and in the end, Goal pulls Rufus out of there and lands splat, kinda on top of her, and it looks a bit titillating, and I like that.
It's generally really interesting to see how each chapter has its own color scheme. The chapter I was referring to is extremely purple. Then there's a blue chapter. We also have a chapter that's relatively green. And sometimes we had a wall full of background screens, like all printed out as photos, and you could see really nicely how everything has its very own color. What I noticed is that this Deponia has a lot of nature in it. That's something we didn't do until now. You know, we never had that many plants drawn in any Deponia.